Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. As always, most importantly, thank you for listening, and thank you for all the communications, the emails and letters that you send to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I read every one of them, and in the past couple of weeks, letters from listeners have provided ideas for shows that we're going to pursue. This week, one of our favorite guests, our returning champion, Professor Joseph Ellis, joins us. And Clay, you and he had a really enjoyable and interesting conversation.
Today, our subject was the Constitution, and I'm teaching this Constitution online course. It's going great guns. We'll probably do another one in the late summer or fall, so sign up or express your interest if you're interested. But somebody's been asking me, well, who wasn't at the Constitutional Convention? Of course, Patrick Henry wasn't there, and Samuel Adams wasn't there, and Thomas Paine wasn't there. But the two people who really weren't there are Jefferson and Adams. They were respectively in Paris and in London at the time. And it's hard to know what would have happened if they had been there, but I don't think it necessarily would have been a good thing for Jefferson to be there. He wouldn't have gone anyway because he's so shy. He would have just sent some kind of a draft along with Madison and asked Madison to introduce it, but, Teflon Jefferson. But Adams would have been there, and he would have been feisty Adams. He would have been, Gouverneur Morris gave 173 speeches, the most of anybody. Adams would have given 370 speeches, and he would have been standing up and talking all the time and rebuking people and insisting on having port or claret late at night with them and to hammer things out. And he would have had a new idea every day, and he would have made a complete nuisance of himself, but he would have been drop dead brilliant in everything that he had to say. So it's one of the sort of weird factoids of American history that the person who knew more about constitutions than any other single human being at the time, John Adams, was marooned in London, where they didn't take him at all seriously, when if he had been in Philadelphia, who knows how our Constitution might have been different, but it certainly would have been a different story of the Constitutional Convention, because you can't imagine Adams being part of any group where he did not dominate in some way or other.
I'm going to do something here that I never do, which is cut you off a bit short.
Uh-oh.
And the reason for it is that I want to add some of the after the show conversation that you and Joe had that I really enjoyed. The show is limited to an hour for the broadcast version, but you two didn't want to stop talking. And you were discussing a column that Joe wrote titled Dialogue on the Mall. He sent it to us, and there was a disagreement, I think, about what is actually the words that are embedded in the wall at the Jefferson Memorial.
I'd like to talk to.
Well, we'll do that. We'll do that in the next round. But here it is, Joe. You say that Jefferson said, nothing is more certainly written in the Book of Faith than that these people must and will be free. And then he says, and yet the minute we free them, we have to get rid of them. The first part of that is actually on the wall at the Jefferson Memorial. Nothing is more certainly written in the Book of Faith than that this people must and will be free. They have that.
Yeah, they have that, but they don't have the second.
25 years ago, I gave a talk at Monticello about the future of interpretation of Jefferson. I was part of a panel of a bunch of people, and I said, I said, I really find the Jefferson Memorial troubling because it says nothing is more certainly written in the Book of Faith than this people must and will be free. And I said, yeah, okay, but the rest of the sentence says, let's get rid of them once and for all. We don't want to live with them. I said, don't you think that needs to, how can you quote Jefferson so out of context to make him look like he is better on the problem of slavery than he is? And several people from the Jefferson Memorial there were so angry about that. Well, now, as you know, the same people want to tear the damn thing down.
That's right. Now the choice is between, tearing it down or not. And I was arguing, and I really feel strongly about this, and we might hope to talk about this in the subsequent program, that those people who want to tear it down don't realize what they're suggesting. They are suggesting they want to try to remove from American history the voice of the magic words of American history. And those magic words about equality are the one thing that you cannot ever, ever get rid of, because Jefferson wrote them. And he knew it. And I mean, that's the reason he put it on his first on his tombstone. Didn't even put the presidency on. This is the driving force of the egalitarian spirit in American history. And if you decide to kill it, you are committing suicide.
And furthermore, the historians who have said, including Merrill Peterson, that if you want to come to terms with the paradoxes of American life, the person you have to keep at center stage is Thomas Jefferson. He embodies all the best and some of the worst in the American spirit, and he's the one who does that more clearly than any other single founding father. You got to keep him, warts and all, if you want to try to understand this crazy country.
I'm so upset to hear that he said that, because I thought that was original with me.
No, but doesn't matter, because you're both right.
Clay, good talking, and David, thanks for putting up with me.
It's always great to talk to you.
Talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
David, thanks for having that bonus material from our conversation. You know, once Joe gets started, and I find him so very fascinating, and I love to just tee up a little question for him and watch him hit triples and home runs over and over and over again. He's an extraordinary gift to us, to you as a human being, to me, and to the Thomas Jefferson.
I loved it in the show. You're saying, you know, I read this biography of Jefferson years ago, and the author talked about, I think it was American Sphinx. That was great. So it's a real pleasure to have Joe. Let me say this much more as we say hello in the year 2021 to our Jefferson Hour listeners. First of all, of course, thank you. We're so grateful that you listen. Please tell everyone you know. If you can contribute to our small entity, we take great joy in that. We appreciate all the correspondence that we get from everyone. The courses that I'm teaching are really important to me. If you're interested, I'll be doing one on Hamlet, which is April 10th through May 1st, 4 weeks on Hamlet by Shakespeare. March 6th through 27th, J. Robert Oppenheimer. We had so many people who could not go to the Locksaw retreat because they were concerned about COVID, and so we want to be able to give them a version of the very successful retreat we had on J. Robert Oppenheimer. And then on May 8th through June 4th, I'm teaching a course at a local Catholic university on North Dakota and the Great Plains. And this course will be on Great Plains literature, including My Antonia by Willa Cather, and something called Dust Bowl Diary by a North Dakota woman named Anne Marie Lowe, and probably O.E. Rolvog's Giants in the Earth, but these classics of Great Plains literature, trying to understand this strange and wonderful section of North America. And that'll be also when my book comes out. My North Dakota book I just got emails while we were recording today that they are in process now, the last of the copy edits, and moving towards production and design. And the book will come out approximately the last week in May, maybe the first week in June. So that book will be central to that course. All of this is such a great time in my life, David. When the all clear comes, it's going to be, I wonder if we'll ever go back to the old system of doing the Jefferson Hour. This really works, this virtual approach. I thought we would lose a lot because you and I kind of play off each other's body language, but I think this really works. I do too. And it's the smart thing to do and the safe thing to do. Having said that, we wish everybody stay safe, stay healthy. We're going to get through this. We can just kind of see the glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel. So it's all the more reason to stay vigilant. And with that, I would say again, thanks for your support of the show. And if you do have questions about Clay's, the mail we get now is like 2-to-1 asking about your courses. If people want to know more about that, go to jeffersonhour.com. And with that, shall we go to this week's show?
We shall do it. Thanks, everyone. And please enjoy this special conversation with the returning champion, Mr. Joseph Ellis.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about President Thomas Jefferson. I'm your host, David Swenson, joined this week by the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson, and our returning champion, one of our favorite guests, Professor Joseph Ellis, and welcome to both of you, gentlemen.
Hello, Joe. We're always glad to hear you. So we haven't talked with you for a few weeks. I take it that you weathered the holidays up there at your Fortress of Solitude in Vermont.
I did, and just recently have found myself rooting for a former member of the New England Patriots named Tom Brady, who succeeded in winning the Super Bowl.
I read a news report this morning, Joe, that said that there was a Venezuelan company that was involved in changing the scoreboard, and in fact, the Patriots didn't win.
I heard similar stories, and I'm sure that there's a powerful argument that can be made that Kansas City actually won the Super Bowl.
Well,
shall we move on to something more serious, Clay?
Well, I think the analogy is apt. We're in this odd situation. This is something that goes back to a conversation Joe and I had late in the autumn. Our system has a set of rules, but it also depends upon a shared commitment to honor those norms. And if somebody decides he's not going to honor those norms, it turns out it's chaos.
Right. I would like to embrace what I strongly believe, and I think Clay and David will both agree, it is a Jeffersonian principle that I'm embracing here, that American presidential elections ought to be thoroughly democratic. That means no electoral college. Madison and Jefferson both indicated their surprise that this thing called the Electoral College was adopted soon afterwards in 1787 in correspondence. And we should have done away with this thing a century ago. And according to the popular vote, Biden received 79 million votes, and Trump received between 72 and 73 million. I think that's a pretty clear margin. Once you get into electoral college matters, there's room for mischief at each stage, and the electoral college does not accurately reflect the population of the United States. So I think the Patriots won, and I think Biden won.
Well, it might be a matter of technology available at the time too, don't you think?
That was absolutely correct, David. In the debates over the presidency and how to elect the president, it began by thinking that it shouldn't be one person; it should be three people because they were afraid of a monarch. And then they said, okay, one person. And then they thought it should be a person with 1 6-year term. And they changed that to 4-year term. And then there was some thought that there should be a limit on the term, but they imagined Washington as the first president, and because it was a foregone conclusion. So there was a lot of discussion then about whether it could just be done by a popular vote. And it was the size of the argument was it was impractical to be able to get the results of the vote in less than 2 or 3 months, and that was unacceptable. And one of the reasons that James Wilson of Pennsylvania argued strongly for a popular election, but they went with the Electoral College approach, and it's always been a kind of Rube Goldberg contraption. The rest of the world doesn't know what in heaven's name it is, and I think a lot of Americans aren't quite sure themselves. But let's just agree on the Jefferson hour right now that Jefferson unequivocally and clearly would favor popular election of the presidency, and the sooner we do this, the better off we'll all be.
Agreed to that, especially now that we have the technologies that enable us to get those results more or less instantaneously. That was the big concern back then. So, Joe, that gives me a chance to open the door to my first question for today. I'm teaching this online course on the U.S. Constitution. And of course, the minute you look at this, you realize the following, that there were some key people who were not among the 55 delegates in Philadelphia. And I have a little list of them here. One of them was Samuel Adams. Another was Patrick Henry. Another was Thomas Paine. But the two, and George Wythe was there briefly. He was one of the most learned small r Republicans in the country. He was the first law professor in the United States, but his wife was ill, so he retired after just a couple of weeks. But the two figures that are most conspicuously missing are Thomas Jefferson, who was the American minister to France, and John Adams. And of the two, John Adams is the more important person who was missing, because nobody, I think it's fair to say nobody in the country, and it's even, I think, fair to say nobody in the world knew more about constitutions and the history of constitutions than did John Adams. He had written this immense defense of the constitutions of the United States. He had helped to write the Massachusetts state constitution after the Revolution. He's the one at the Continental Congress who called for the delegates in each state to meet and form their own constitutions in the wake of the collapse of British colonial occupation. So
yeah, and he wrote a paper. He wrote during the time in the Second Continental Congress. He'd written these letters to different delegations saying, "Here's what you might think about doing," and then they said, "Well, why don't you just write a single thing that all of us can look at?" And he wrote this thing called Thoughts on Government, and it was a model for what became the federal national constitution, with a principle of balance of powers, rule of law, separation of church and state. And especially balance of powers, which is usually described as a Madisonian idea, which it was, but Adams is the real originator. And so I think we agree, Clay, that Adams is the missing, he's the guy that should have been there, and you wonder what he would have said, but since he didn't have anything else to do in London because the British ministry wouldn't meet with him, sending John Adams to be the first American ambassador to the court of St. James was like sending Luther to be the first ambassador to the Vatican, and they wouldn't talk to him. So in lieu of that, he started work on what became a 3-volume work called The Defense of the Constitutions of the United States, meaning the state constitutions. And I think that there are Virginians who would disagree with us, even though I'm born a Virginian. They would say George Mason is a equivalently knowledgeable constitutional scholar. I think that's a plausible argument, but in the end, I'd go with Adams, just as you do.
Well, there were three. So George Wythe, an extraordinary man.
And he was Jefferson's law teacher, right? Yeah.
George Mason, who Jefferson called the American Cato, going back to the Roman Republic, kind of the crabby, small r Republican on steroids, frightened of government, but the author of the Virginia Declaration of Rights. And then you have James Madison, who got up to speed. Jefferson sent him 80-some books, and Madison read them and digested them. And James Wilson. So you had a significant number of people who really knew something about the history of constitutions. But if Adams had been there, he would have been an invaluable asset. But can you kind of speculate on what we gained and what we lost by not having John Adams there?
The single most important area in which Adams would have been outspoken is to say that we should not overlearn the lessons of 76, and in so doing limit the authority of the executive, or what we'll come to call the president, and that we need a strong executive in a republic to offset the values of the oligarchs that might come to power, or of the people at large who are interested in what's popular, but not necessarily what's in the long-term public interest. So he really saw the person who is president as a person who should be able to stand above all partisanship, and he himself, as president, tried to do that. That's where I think his major influence would have been. And if you actually read Article 2 of the Constitution, which is the area that describes executive power, I challenge you to tell me what it says a president can do and not do. It is so ambiguous because, and they talk about it on 3 occasions, once in June, once in July, and once in August for about a week and a half each time. Monarchy is the ghost at the banquet. So is slavery. Monarchy, they can't stop talking about. It's such a threat. Slavery is so threatening, they can't talk about it at all. They can't use the word slave or slavery. They talk about that species of property. But Adams, in a letter to Jefferson later that you know well, Clay, said something very important here. He said, Jefferson, you fear the one, I fear the few. Jefferson was most concerned about monarchical power, and if Jefferson were president, he and Adams would have had a big argument about this. Adams believed the major threat to the values of the republic would come from an oligarchy. And if I may say so now, I think what we face is both forms of a challenge. A threat that an ex-president believes he's above the law and needs to be reinstated in the same way that a Putin would or whatever, but also a Congress which is a plutocracy and an oligarchy. Those are bold statements and you can disagree with them, but I think that the interesting thing is Adams and Jefferson together constitute the most potent discussion of the threats that both monarchy and oligarchy represent to the survival of the republic.
Gentlemen, we need to take a short break. We'll return to this conversation in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. This week we're speaking with the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson, and one of our favorite returning guests, Professor Joseph Ellis. And when we took our break, Joe, you were talking about the worries between Jefferson and Adams of monarchy and oligarchs.
Creating a nation-sized republic was an unprecedented act. And both Adams and Jefferson, as well as many of the other well-read members of the Constitutional Convention, looked back to ancient Greece and Rome and the recent experience in England as for the lessons. Jefferson believed that the major threat that the republic faced was a monarch who would become a dictator. And Adams believed that the major threat that the republic faced was a group of elected representatives who would just become an oligarchy and would use money as the basis for their control over the Congress of the United States.
So if we look at the system, first of all, if Jefferson and Adams weren't there, afterwards, I think Adams found less to dislike than Jefferson. Jefferson was pretty critical of the Constitution. He actually suggested to Madison that it was a nice first draft. And they might want to go back and rethink some things and refine what they had done based upon the reactions they were getting from the 13 states. Madison didn't find that very amusing. But I think in the long run, Adams was happier with the result than Jefferson was, although Jefferson is the great champion of a Bill of Rights, and he helped to...
That's what, I was going to say, Clay, Jefferson was concerned much more about a Bill of Rights than the Constitution itself. And he said that the failure to provide a Bill of Rights in the document itself was a fatal failure. And that's what he, in his letters with Madison, that's what he kept saying.
And he was right. So Jefferson was right. The Bill of Rights is an incalculably more important document, in my view, than the Constitution itself. It's one of the greatest achievements of humankind, I believe. And not that Madison might not have done it otherwise, but Jefferson was a very strong, persuasive force. He said things pretty absolutely. He said, what every people on earth has a right to expect against its government is a Bill of Rights. And then he said, this can never be left to inference. It has to be spelled out in plain English. Do you have any sense of how Adams reacted to the document when he finally read it?
I think that he was worried that it gave the executive branch would become too weak, but I think you're right. He was, the difference between them is fundamental, though, Clay, for the reasons that you've just articulated implicitly. The Bill of Rights is a statement of the things the federal government cannot do. And it thereby protects individual rights from government power.
And states, too, in the 10th Amendment.
That's correct. But it is that Jefferson always believed that we shouldn't have fundamentally replaced the Articles of Confederation. We should have revised them, maybe given the federal government some power over foreign policy.
Taxation.
It overdid what it was supposed to do. And he's right about that. They didn't really have the authority to do in Philadelphia what they did. Jefferson believed we were and always would be a confederation of sovereign states. Adams embraced the notion, which Madison at the time also argued for, and so did Washington, that the Constitution created a nation, not a confederation, with a federal government that did have power over domestic policy as well as foreign policy. And that's a fundamental difference between them.
I want to ask you a question about the Senate here in a minute, but before that, somebody in my Constitution class was asking about the two Madisons. So at the Constitutional Convention, Madison is an ardent nationalist. He wanted there to be proportional representation in both houses. He wanted the national government to have an absolute veto over state legislation, and not just state legislation that impinged on federal authority, but all state legislation. He and Hamilton were very similar in many respects at that point.
Right.
But then when Jefferson came back from Europe, Madison began to veer towards the 10th Amendment and more towards Jefferson's idea of a confederation, and he wrote the Virginia resolutions while Jefferson wrote the Kentucky resolutions in 1898. And as you know, Joe, Hamilton...
1798.
Exactly, 1798. He wrote the Virginia resolutions in 1798 as Jefferson wrote the parallel Kentucky resolutions of 1798. And as you know, Joe, Hamilton was perplexed by this and to a certain extent hurt by this. He thought, what happened to Jemmy Madison? He was my ally. We wrote the Federalist Papers together.
Yeah, he's colleague in writing the Federalist Papers.
And so what do you make of it that Madison becomes a Jeffersonian when Jefferson returns, but he was kind of a Hamiltonian before that?
I've written about this too, and it's a mystery. Well, nobody will know the real answer, but here's my thoughts. That you're absolutely right. It's almost like Jefferson comes back from Paris and becomes Secretary of State, and Madison goes in, kneels down before his mentor, and immediately changes his position. I think that something else happened that also affected Madison's thinking and caused him to make a major, in fact, 180-degree change in his view of what the federal government could or could not do. He ran for office in Virginia. He wanted to run for the Senate, but Patrick Henry, who hated him, and Jefferson, blocked him on that and by his control of the legislature. Senators were elected by the legislature then. But he ran for the House and won against Monroe, who Henry put up as a candidate who he thought would have a good chance of winning. But Madison won anyway. In that campaign, however, as he traveled throughout the counties in his district, and it had been gerrymandered, so he would lose by Henry again, but he won anyway. He heard the people of Virginia say that they really were upset at the fact that there wasn't a Bill of Rights and that the federal government was assuming powers which were worrisome to them. This was especially true among slave owners who thought that the assumption of federal power might spell emancipation efforts and the end of slavery. I don't think that was the primary thinking of Madison, but Madison had been made aware that his constituency, the people he represented, were opposed to the powers that the federal government theoretically could exercise in a Hamiltonian universe. And so he switches sides. And what you said is right. Not only, later on he writes the the Virginia resolutions, but that even as early as 1791, he starts under a pseudonym writing articles for magazines and newspapers covertly that oppose the national bank, which is the creeping federal power that he now comes to oppose. There are really three Madisons. He changes again in 1828, and because by that time the slaveocracy, the people who are defending slavery, say, "Oh, Madison is on our side. Madison is a believer in state rights, and that means there can be no federal legislation over slavery, and that a state has a right to secede from the Union if, in fact, it believes that its rights are being violated." And Madison then changes and says, "No, that's not what I meant. That's not at all what Jefferson meant either." There's a book by a Harvard law professor whose name is escaping me that is the most recent biography of Madison, and it's called The Three Madisons. Its excellence is it shows you how different he was. Its weakness is he doesn't show you how they're connected at all, and because they don't seem to be intellectually or logically connected.
Yeah, so I want to just follow up with that for a second. So it's called The Three Lives of James Madison, and it's by Noah Feldman. But
Thank you.
But to this point, it says something pretty special about Thomas Jefferson, that when he comes back from France, his charisma, his persuasiveness, his aura, whatever it is so strong that Madison, I won't say betrays his principle. You've shown that he had some reasonable concerns about Hamilton's system, but that Madison is drawn back towards a more Jeffersonian persuasion. That tells you something really important about the power of Thomas Jefferson in private conversation in over a glass of claret.
I think that's true. I don't disagree with that at all. Madison saw himself as a protege of Jefferson. And a lot of things that we think are Jeffersonian are really Madisonian in some respect. And Madison, and when Jefferson is on his deathbed, or almost on his deathbed, his last conversation with Madison, he says, "Take care of me when I am dead." And Madison tried to do that, to defend Jefferson's reputation, because the slaveocracy was attempting to embrace Jefferson as their spiritual leader, and Madison wanted to protect him from that shadow. I think that but the point you're making is that in ways that are really important, that Jefferson's sheer personality and sheer power of imagination captivated Madison, and Madison thought of Jefferson as the great thinker, and that he was a pragmatist who implemented Jefferson's ideas, at times making them more palatable to audiences, but that Jefferson was his mentor, his leader, his spiritual source.
Whatever is the case, Hamilton was deeply perplexed by this and annoyed by it too, and he must have hated Jefferson the more for seducing Madison away from him. David, I know you have a question.
Well, actually, I have a question from a listener, Jeffrey Charney, and he's asking about political parties and how that's really not mentioned in the Constitution. They didn't anticipate it, or maybe they did, but nowadays how members of Congress tend to vote along party lines, and that wasn't really anticipated and is almost unconstitutional. I'd like to hear from both of you about that.
Nobody anticipated political parties, and the term political party was an epithet. They thought of parties much in the way that we now think of lobbyists, as people that intrude into the political process in ways that are partisan and disruptive and usually dangerous. Jefferson felt this as strongly as anybody, and Clay will recognize the quote I'm about to give. Jefferson said, "If I must go to heaven in a political party, I prefer not to go at all." But parties are coming into existence in the 1790s. Jefferson becomes the spiritual leader of what becomes the Republican Party, the first opposition party. But he could pass a lie detector test on saying that he has not done that. I have always been mystified about how he can become the head of what's called the Republican Party, and it's not called the Democratic Republican Party, as you'll see in some textbooks, and do things, that are partisan behind the scenes, but really never believe that he's being partisan.
Well, I agree with you, but part of my understanding of this comes from a book I once read by a professor from the East Coast called American Sphinx, and in it, this guy argues that Jefferson could wall off separate parts of his consciousness and keep them from talking to each other to the point that he actually came to believe that these things were not integrated. And so that's a key insight. But I think here's how I see it, Joe. You tell me if I'm right or wrong. I think Jefferson believed that he represented the people, and he says things like this, like 90 or 95% of the American people are really small r Republicans, and the Federalists represent an elite coup d'etat that took over. They're some admirable people, but they got ahead of themselves and they took over and pretended to represent the people, but they don't represent the people. They're the English party, they're the monarchical party, they're the aristocratical party, and the mass of people are really Jeffersonians. And so I'm not part of a party. I'm America, and these other guys really aren't. These other guys are a bunch of people who are leaning back towards England and trying to create a hierarchical American society based on property and authority and distinguished families. And because of that, I'm going to make the Second American Revolution. That's not a party event. That's the reclaiming of America by the actual people of America. I think that's how he saw it, Joe.
He did. And I don't disagree with your characterization of his thinking on this. I think, though, that what it turned out to mean was that he did not believe there was such a thing as a legitimate opposition.
That's correct.
That you were either all in with him or you were part of, in Hamilton, and Washington fits into this, represented a hostile takeover of the true values of the American Revolution.
That's exactly right. And he thought that Washington was a good small r Republican himself, but that he'd grown senile and he had been seduced by the evil genius of American life, Colonel Hamilton.
Let me take Jeff Charney's question just a little farther. I mean, again, he's saying that during Jefferson's time, members of Congress were expected to vote as individuals. Nowadays, we know congressmen vote along party lines. Have the founders at the Constitutional Convention anticipated the effect of political parties? Do you think they would have addressed it?
I think they would have tried. I don't know what they could have done that would have made a fundamental difference with the way in which things played out. That is, because political parties were beginning to come into existence in the British system, I think that the distinctive development, which really occurs with the election of Jefferson in 1800 and the transfer of power, the creation of what I referred to earlier as legitimate opposition. That is, you win and then you lose. And when you lose, you go into a position as legitimate critics of the winning side, but that you do not kill them. You do not put them on the guillotine. You do not put them, as in the Russian Revolution, against the firing squad wall. And that this is a conversation, an ongoing conversation between two different versions of what the principles of the revolution are.
We need to take a break here in just a moment, but Clay, I want to give you the last word.
Well, just quickly, I think that the founding fathers were sort of deluding themselves, because later Jefferson said, I get it. Political parties are as natural as anything else in the world. It's really a question of zoology, that people are factional and they're going to create some sort of a system of give and take, of yin and yang. And I think what's amazing is how quickly the Constitution absorbed the idea of parties. So the 12th Amendment, which was passed in 1804, addressed this because Burr and Jefferson had tied in the Electoral College, and the people who saw that wanted that never to happen again. And so they then devised the 12th Amendment, which created ticketing and separated vice president from president in the way that they're chosen by the Electoral College. So that did it. That made it possible for parties to flourish without, clouding their original idealism. Was that the most respected person would be first in the Electoral College and the second most respected person would be second. And the fact is, the party system has been able to work within the Constitution in a really effective way. It didn't ruin the Constitution. It creates some distortive pressures, but it hasn't been at fundamental odds with our constitutional program.
We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Welcome back to this special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour with what we call the returning champion, our friend, the Emeritus Professor of History, Mr. Joseph Ellis, Dr. Joseph Ellis, the winner of the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award, among others. Joe, as we ended the second segment of the program, I was trying to make the case that the party system caused some pressures on our Constitution, but it didn't break it.
No, and I think what it did, and I've got a lot invested in this being right, so if you disagree, please make it clear. What it did was redefine the Constitution, not as a set of clear truths, but as a framework in which we can argue about what the truths are. That is to say, a dialogue. That America is not founded on a proposition, it's founded on an argument about what that proposition means. I mean, Jefferson wrote the proposition that I'm referring to, and it's not in the Constitution, it's in the Declaration, of course. That argument itself is the answer, and the willingness to recognize the legitimacy of different sides in an argument is the crucial fuel that makes the American Republic go forward.
I have a couple of thoughts about this, Joe. I want to run them by you. First of all, I think the Constitution has worked exceedingly well. There are some fracture points. We need to think about the Emoluments Clause. We need to think about the Pardon Clause. We need to think about the Electoral College. I think we're going to have to revisit the Second Amendment at some point. There are things that are not working well in our Constitution or that desperately need clarification. But if you look at it from kind of a broader perspective, the system worked as it was designed to work. The House is closer to the people and therefore more volatile. The Senate isn't exactly what the Founding Fathers had in mind, but it has served as a cooling dish. As George Washington said, just look at what happened in the certification of the election of Joe Biden. The House was much more volatile and willing to be more disruptive because they lean more closely on the people and they have to go back and get reelected in a year and a half. And they were worried that they would be primaried from the right. The Senate, because it has a 6-year term, can afford to be a little more circumspect about these questions. I don't think the senators are better men and women than the congressmen and women, but they have the advantage of a structure that gives them a slightly greater detachment from the immediate will of the people. The system works. I mean, it's not exactly what John Adams or Jefferson or even James Madison would have had in mind, but the difference between the Senate and the House has never been more apparent than it has been, in my opinion, in the last few years. I think the issue in the Senate is the filibuster. And I want to ask you this question, Joe. I see the filibuster, which is not, of course, in the Constitution at all, as really a part of Jim Crow. It has been invented and used by the Southern slaveocracy and their descendants to prevent social justice legislation, that it really is one of the most offensive things in the entire constitutional system because its purpose was to prevent apartheid and slavery from being damaged by the majority in our national Congress. And I feel like that it's time for us to admit that this is a white supremacist norm that we should jettison finally, even though that represents some danger when you have a 51% victory in both the House and the Senate? What do you think?
I think that you're right that the history of that parliamentary device it does speak primarily with a Southern accent. There used to be some legitimacy to it. If you'll remember the Jimmy Stewart character in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, standing up and spending hours, because the original form of this was you had to get up and speak for a very long time. Now the way in which it works is all you got to do is raise your hand and stop something. And I think the Senate has adopted a variety of parliamentary devices over the recent 50 years that essentially make the Senate a place where everything goes to die. And those are additions that are rooted in not just in racial values, but also in the Senate's sense of its significance as this, the great deliberative body in America. It's become something other than that, I think. But I agree with you. There's nothing in the Constitution to justify this, and the filibuster, I think, should be done away with. The irony is the one area where the filibuster doesn't apply is in the selection of Supreme Court justices. I think since those are lifetime appointments at present, that's the one area when you should probably say that it should be a 60-vote majority to put people on to the Supreme Court. But it's the one thing that doesn't work. And now, in the end, I think we need to do away with the filibuster and a variety of other parliamentary maneuvers. Like when they recently kept trying to explain to us why it was taking so long for the Senate to approve Biden's appointments to the cabinet, it's like you need some sort of map into some labyrinthian terrain to figure this all out. Senate rules need to be revised, and the problem is that in order to revise them, you got to get the Senate to approve them, and they won't do that.
That's certainly true. The Founding Fathers demanded supermajorities for certain things. They needed a 2/3 majority for treaties. They needed a 2/3 majority to convict an impeached national officer, including the president. So they understood the difference between majority rule and certain questions.
And also for constitutional amendment.
That's right. And so, but they did not ask for a supermajority for simple legislation. The idea was that the House would pass laws with 51% of the vote, and the Senate would pass laws with 51% of its vote. And the different way that they were selected would give us some differential in the way that they explored proposed legislation. None of the Founding Fathers ever suggested that it should take 6 out of 10 votes in the Senate to pass key legislation. That's a norm that was invented, and invented indeed, to please Southern interests. And now we need to get rid of it because it is actually holding up the very process of government. Imagine if there were a 51% trigger, how much legislation would have been passed in the last 30 years that has been held up in the Senate.
I agree. And most of it is good legislation, although, but if you believe the government is the deep state, that it can do nothing for you but come. It's the Reagan line. The most terrifying words that can be uttered is someone from the federal government coming and saying, "I'm here to help you." Right. I'm not sure that's any longer relevant if you're going to get a vaccine, and if you're going to get an injection of federal support from the federal support from the federal government to offset the losses of the pandemic. And so Biden's initiative here might very well suggest that we need to rethink the notion of the federal government as some domestic version of the evil empire. But yes, let's do away. We're really being radical here, but let's do away with the Electoral College and let's do away with the filibuster.
So, Joe, let me ask you one last question. Joe Biden has already issued dozens of executive orders. As you know, they're not enumerated in the Constitution. Donald Trump issued many executive orders. They all do but increasingly they're doing it in very substantive issues like DACA and the Dreamers and environmental regulatory positions and so on. As a constitutionalist, this has to bother you, even if you see why it happens.
Absolutely. Like during the inauguration, I was doing interviews with different groups, and one of them was with the BBC. And the BBC said, the guy from the BBC said, "Do you think that we, meaning Europe, can trust Biden?" And I said, "Well, I think you can trust Biden, but I'm not sure you can trust America." And what I had in mind was exactly what you're talking about. If everything can only pass by executive order, every time you get a new president, they're going to change the executive orders. And if you're looking at us from outside, from the American role in international community, well, we signed the Iran treaty, then we step away. We signed the Paris Accords, then we step away. Now we're going to sign them again. Maybe we'll step away again. We are not a reliable world power if, in fact, that's how we make legislation. And the function and the reason it's becoming necessary to do that is what we were talking about earlier. The Senate has become a place where all good ideas go to die.
But you don't want the executive order of one president to reduce the size of a national monument and then it to be restored to its size and then reduced again. And if you think about the DACA situation, that's truly heartbreaking that millions of young people who were brought here by their families when they were too young to really even know what was happening are suddenly legitimized by one president through executive order and then delegitimized by his successor through executive order, and then re-legitimized by his successor. Human beings deserve better than to be part on this roller coaster or this yo-yo ride in the way that our government now operates, which is decidedly not constitutional, not intended by the founding fathers.
And not especially intended by Jefferson, who thought that the exercise of executive power should be restricted. And this makes everything almost executive orders. He would not like that. And I think he would argue that, that if 51% of the people want this, we're going to go with it. And we're not going to let one branch of the federal government block everything. Let's more than 50. I remember during the debates after the massacre in Connecticut, debate over some sort of restrictions on guns or registration and automatic weapons, 89% polled to say we needed some laws that made those regulations real. They never even came up for a vote because they were blocked. And they were blocked because the National Rifle Association has a stranglehold over some members of both branches of Congress.
That's a really interesting point and leads me to a question for both of you, if I might, sir.
Yes,
of course.
In the new American rules by Clay and Joe, we're not going to have an electoral college and we're not going to have a filibuster. Well, I bring up a third one that really bothers me. There are pieces of legislation pending or dead that the American public has supported overwhelmingly, and yet the Senate and the House refuse to acknowledge that the public support for these bills. I mean, that to me is a real problem. How do we ever get Congress to listen to the public will?
Well, you hold them accountable by diselecting them if they don't. That's the only way you can do it. We don't have a national initiative or a national referendum. Those are progressive era policies that work at the state level in most states. But in the national government, you have to hold your representatives accountable. And that, unfortunately, is usually used in the wrong way. They're usually held accountable for the good things that they do rather than for the good things that they don't.
That's that old thing about everybody in Congress is a scoundrel, except my guy.
I think that when Mitch McConnell was teaching a course on government at Louisville University, in his first class, he would always go to the board and say there were only three things you have to have in mind to understand the way in which politics works. He wrote three words: money, money, and money.
I'll go one step farther as we close this program, just so that the Joe/Clay constitutional reform movement can really get upset. I think that one of the biggest problems in America is the Great Compromise. I think the fact that North Dakota has 2 senators with 750,000 people and California has 2 senators with 40 million people is no longer an acceptable differential. I think the fact that Wyoming has 570,000 people and 2 United States senators, and Texas has 25 million people and just 2 United States senators, that might have made some sense at the time when this was fabricated in the Great Compromise on July 17, 1787. But the distortion of representation that now exists between the giant states like Texas and Florida and New York and California and the puny states like mine, North Dakota, or Vermont or Alaska is a scandal to the idea of democracy, and we need to produce a new formula, which I know is an impossible thing to do.
I completely agree, and I'm residing right now in Vermont, which is also a small state. But I'll tell you, I've traveled around Vermont and given talks, and I've raised this question for Vermonters. I don't know whether the same thing would be true in North Dakota or not, or Wyoming, but polls show that a majority of Vermonters are in favor of exactly the reform you're talking about. And they're also in favor, and this same principle is what gives the Electoral College its disproportionate character. They're in favor of a popular election of the president. So that polls show that people won't necessarily vote what you think they might regard as their own political interest. I mean, people in North Dakota are probably having a heart attack right now when you're talking, Clay. But it's clear from a Jeffersonian point of view, if in fact you really believe in democracy and the people's judgment, those are reforms which should be put on the table.
Larry Sabatos of the University of Virginia has a plan for this, and I think I have a different plan myself, but his plan is that every state gets to keep its 2, but certain states get 3 or 4 or even 5, and that would raise the total number in the Senate to 135. That's his plan. My plan would be to give North Dakota 1 and Minnesota 2 and Illinois 3 and say Virginia 4, but Texas, California, Florida, and New York 5. The small number would get 5, a somewhat larger number 4, and it would work its way down, but you would always get at least 1, and then we could try to keep it to 100.
I like it. At this stage, under the rubric of dialogue, this should be part of the American dialogue.
Well, here in North Dakota, people would say, wait a minute, did you say you want to give California 5 U.S. senators? Are you nuts? We don't even want them to be part of the union. We should expel California.
Joe, it's always great to talk with you every time you come on the show. And the phrase you used this week that really stuck out to me is that the argument is the answer.
I hope it's true. I believe it.
But it needs to be a civil argument. Otherwise, Thomas Jefferson is no longer happy.
No, and there's always a trap door for Jefferson to get out of here. Namely, he's not frozen in 76 or in the 18th century. Every generation is sovereign, he said. And that means that science would proceed and reveal new things that were not at all clear in the 18th century. And he'd expected us to grow, and he expected his own ideas to have expansive meanings. I can imagine him having a good conversation with Martin Luther King about what it means to say that all men are created equal, in which he is open to an understanding that includes people who are black as well as white.
Gentlemen, thanks for a great conversation this week. Joe, come back soon, will you?
Thanks to our dear friend Joseph Ellis. We will see you all next week for another exciting edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.